My name is Dean. I'm a person in long-term recovery from addiction, and this is Inside Addiction. My guest today is Robert Lindsay, CEO of Friends of Recovery New York. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dean. And first of all, I want to say to you personally how grateful I am for your commitment to this show and to bringing the message and information to the public about addiction and recovery.
Thank you.
It's a terrific gift and really appreciate all that you've done.
So, Robert, education, advocacy, building support systems for people affected by the disease of addiction. Where do you want to start?
Well, why don't we do this? Why don't I first just tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this work, because I think it's important. Myself, like many others, I come from a family with a long history of alcoholism and addiction. I have 11 family members living life today in recovery from addiction all over the country. My brother-in-law has 120 days. My cousin down in Florida has 38 years.
That's great.
And everybody in between. We've lost family members as well. The reality is that alcoholism and addiction is the single greatest health problem in this country today.
Absolutely.
And the other side of that, Dean, and you know this very well, is the public has no clue about the reality that 23 million people today are living life in recovery. All of the news, all of the coverage out there in the public is about the drama and the chaos of active alcoholism and addiction. The public knows that story. They live that story. They can write that story. What they're desperate to hear about is the hope and the help that comes with recovery, both for the individual and for the family.
Absolutely. We do recover. We can recover.
Absolutely.
There are success stories.
There is no question. And again, interesting for me, I've started my work in this field as a volunteer when I was going to college.
What got you interested in this field as opposed to all the other movements out there? Why recovery from addiction?
For me, it's real simple. When I was finishing school and looking at what I wanted to do in my career, it's a bachelor's in psych, a master's in counseling and personnel with a specialization in mental health. I started to look at doing some counseling in school, elementary counseling, high school counseling, some school psych. I was a live-in counselor in a boys' home, worked in a 24-hour crisis center, did some community mental health. But everywhere I went, I saw alcoholism and addiction, whether it was the individual or the family. And regrettably, what I also saw was a whole range of professionals, especially on the mental health side, who had absolutely no idea how to help. And rather than accept the responsibility for the fact that they didn't know how to help, chose to blame the individual or the family for their failure to respond to their good help. And fortunately for me, some people said, look, Lindsay, you're a nice guy. All that academic stuff's great, but come with us to some meetings. And they took me to a lot of open Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, Al-Anon meetings. And I always tell people I learned more there about alcoholism and addiction and recovery than all my academics had taught me. And once I was exposed to recovery, I was hooked. There is no greater opportunity to impact people's lives than to deal with alcoholism and addiction. It has been an absolute privilege to have spent my entire life helping people find their way into recovery and supporting that recovery. That's the answer. Real simple.
So your organization does a lot of things. And again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. Just a couple nights ago, I attended a International Overdose Awareness Vigil that you folks had up in Saratoga and were part of.
Yep.
I know the advocacy days and the marches at the Capitol, September being Recovery Month, but your organization is out there beyond September. October, November, every month, you know, I think it's fair to say available, making themselves available pretty much 365 days out of the year. September is Recovery Month, but it doesn't stop at September.
Without question. First of all, I really need to offer a tribute to the founders of this organization, our board member volunteers who essentially for a number of years ran this organization entirely on their own time, with their own dollars, their own resources, their own commitment and passion for recovery. It's an amazing group of people that still are very engaged as board members in Friends of Recovery New York. And essentially, what we're doing now is we're in a transition period where we've just fortunately received a grant from Oasis.
That's great.
That's going to enable us to build the capacity that we need to mobilize and build the recovery community across New York State and to give recovery a voice. The reality is that individuals and families in recovery need to speak up. They need to be engaged in helping set policy, helping make decisions about programs and services, knocking down the barriers that exist that get in the way of people accessing treatment, accessing recovery supports that are so desperately needed and necessary. And that's really where we are right today, is in that transition period. Literally opened our offices a week and a half ago.
That's great. Bob, let me ask you a question. What do you think are some of the barriers, and what prevents people to speak out?
Yep.
And to take a stand and to be a voice? What do you think that barrier is? Because one of the things that I always go back to is, for example, cancer. Mm-hmm. There's marches everywhere. People
Sure.
are wearing pink, ribbons, balloons, TV coverage across the board.
Yep.
There's never a shortage of people standing up and saying, I'm a cancer survivor. What do you think is keeping so many people, because 23 million of us living in recovery, what prevents a greater number of people getting involved?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that question, but probably the most important question is the stigma that is associated with alcoholism, addiction, and recovery. And so many people feel guilt and shame about what happened during their active alcoholism or addiction, and as a result are reluctant to speak up. From my experience, I wear a wristband that's called Believe in Recovery. I wear it everywhere I go. And part of the focus is this is to make it okay for people to talk about alcoholism and addiction. And I can't tell you how many people I've been able to get into help, either as individuals or families,
Sure.
just because I made it okay to talk about it.
And I'm sure people say, hey, Bob, what's that?
Oh, absolutely. And it really is talking about alcoholism and addiction like we do any other illness. It's a chronic disease. It's chronic. It's progressive, fatal if untreated, genetically predisposed, just like heart disease and diabetes. And when we talk about it in that language, people understand it. So again, I think our biggest challenge is overcoming stigma. The other piece that's a big part of our challenge is that with 23 million people as well living with active addiction over the age of 12, think about the millions of individuals and family members that are living with that, struggling with that, and as a result have all of the negative impressions about what alcoholism and addiction are.
Absolutely. For every person, I've always said, there's at least 3 people impacted, a minimum.
Absolutely. So some of those people are physicians, they're psychiatrists, they're social workers, they're clergy, they're CEOs, they're politicians. They are the people who set policies in place. And if their personal experience with alcoholism and addiction is negative, it will control how they respond to this issue, including the media.
Absolutely.
So again, the focus then is negative, and that's the piece that reinforces that stigma. So what we need are those people that are engaged in those professions that you know and I know, that are living life in recovery today, to speak about that recovery. Matter of fact, like they would, as you said, cancer or heart disease or something else. That begins to break down that stigma, and as a result begins to engage all of us, not in the problem, but in the solution.
Absolutely.
And it's about building recovery support services for individuals and families across New York State.
So let's talk about some of those recovery support services that Friends of Recovery New York is part of, and some of the things that you folks do.
Sure. I mean, when you look at the strategy that we've laid out for Recovery New York, Friends of Recovery New York, it's really built around building this grassroots recovery community organizations across the state. So we're providing technical assistance to these organizations. You mentioned Recovery Advocacy in Saratoga is one of those RCOs.
Raise.
Yeah, and we've been working with RAISE for about a year. It's this terrific group of the community. Long-term recovery, early recovery, families in recovery, families who've lost members to addiction, and they're all focused in the same direction. So we had this remarkable community celebration the other night, which is astounding when we're talking about overdose.
It was beautiful.
But also talking about the hope of recovery.
Absolutely.
And so, again, we want to build these recovery community organizations so they have the capacity to change the culture in their community in the way that it responds to alcoholism, addiction, and recovery. Because that change has to happen locally. We can't do it at the state level. But as they're engaged at the local level, our role and our responsibility is to provide support, provide education and training, whether that be Our Stories Have Power, the science of addiction and recovery, the movie The Anonymous People, a recovery conference. I mean, we're doing all of those things.
So let's talk about those things individually.
Sure.
Our stories have power. Tell me about that.
One of the issues that we struggle with in our field is finding language that we can use to talk about recovery in a way that the public can both hear it and understand it. So that when you and I talk about recovery, the public doesn't know what that means. They may interpret that as that you were drunk or drugged yesterday, but you're in recovery today, you got a bit of a hangover. I mean, that's hard for you and I to understand,
Yeah.
but that's what the public hears.
Sure.
You know, so we need to find language like you used at the beginning of the show, that I'm Dean and I'm a person in long-term recovery. And what that means for me is that I haven't used alcohol or drugs for X period of time, and as a result, here's what's happened in my life. So the rest of the story is here's what's happened in terms of my health, my career, my family, my friends. That's an amazing story.
And it gives people hope.
Absolutely it does. And it takes you away from the drama, the chaos, the negative.
The
and
crime.
Focuses, absolutely.
That's the focus.
And it focuses on the positive. So that training for people is incredibly empowering. Again, both for the individual and for the family. So now I feel comfortable and confident that I can go out and speak with friends, neighbors, coworkers in a way that I respect anonymity, which is critically important, but to be able to talk about alcoholism and addiction like we would any other disease. That's the power of that message.
The science of addiction.
The science of addiction, it's really, again, if we want people to be engaged at the community level, as spokespersons, as advocates, etc., they need good resource and information. So we want to train them in the science of both addiction and recovery. We have a lot of good research out there that people need to be aware of. So that's that piece. Real
That's
simple.
accurate.
Absolutely, absolutely, that's accurate.
Other efforts, other programs that Friends of Recovery is involved in.
One of the things you mentioned was the movie The Anonymous People. The Anonymous People is one of the most powerful documentaries that's ever been done about alcoholism and addiction, and more importantly about recovery. And it includes a lot of those stories that I mentioned of individuals and organizations across the country that are coming together to change the way America treats alcoholism and addiction and recovery. It is an incredibly engaging and powerful documentary. And again, our goal is to reach out into the community and to engage individuals and families that have struggled with addiction one way or the other, or living life in recovery, or have lost a family member. Because without question, their story has power. I can put in front of legislators and policymakers the data. I mean, I can talk about $500 billion a year in cost. I can talk about 132,000 deaths a year due to alcohol and drugs. I can talk about all this. It doesn't mean anything. But when somebody sits down and says to the senator, Senator, I'm sorry for, well, let me go back. This is an important story. Met with a senator one day, and he literally, poking me in the chest, said, don't tell me about alcoholism. My father died of alcoholism. I know more about this than you could ever possibly teach me. And before I could say anything, the man next to me said, "Senator, I'm sorry for your loss. My father died of alcoholism too. But I'm here today as a person in long-term recovery. And my hope is that today you and I are going to be able to sit together and find a way so that kids like you and I don't lose our fathers to alcoholism."
That's the language. That's the conversation that opens doors.
Absolutely. And what we need to recognize is that we know this, that alcoholism and addiction works against its own recovery. We know that as individuals. We know that as families. The same is true in the community. Our job is to be persistent. Our job is to be relentless, to overcome that resistance. And fundamentally, it's not about facts and data. It's about personal stories. So with that senator, by touching his heart, we opened up his brain so he could hear the rest of the message. And that's the piece that we need to recognize. You know, that even people in recovery, what I say to them is that it's critically important to go back to the people who tried to help or did help and say to them, "You haven't seen me, Mr. Policeman. You haven't seen me, Mr. ER doctor, or whoever else for 6 months, 9 months, or a year, because I'm in recovery from alcoholism and addiction. And here's what's happened in my life as a result." Because for them, the only thing they see is active alcoholism or addiction. So they believe that nobody ever gets help or gets well. So if we don't break down that stigma ourselves by talking to them, we're never going to overcome it. So again, speaking out is really important. And we can do that very quietly, and we can do that very simply. And other times, we need to do it very loudly and very collectively. But again, this is really about, our effort is to engage people at that local level and build consensus around what we believe needs to be done to support individuals and families, and then on a proactive basis, go to the governor and to the legislature and say, here's what we need to do.
So Bob, what is it that we need to do with individuals, with families, and then also with our elected officials?
Sure. The first and foremost issue is, and again, this is information, that's it, and that is that in this state, you and I invest billions of dollars in mental health services and developmental disability services. Both of them are almost $4 billion agencies. And the Agency for Alcohol and Drug Services, OASIS, has a total budget of $600 million. So by that being in place, essentially you and I are saying to legislators, that's okay. For every 15 cents that we spend on alcohol and drug services, out of your pocket, we're spending $1 for mental health services. Now, again, that's not at any point to say we should spend less here, but plain and simple, you and I and policymakers in general have not made addiction a priority.
How come?
Well, lots of different reasons. But the reality is what we do is right now we're investing most of our dollars and resources in picking up the consequences of alcoholism and addiction. Gastritis, pancreatitis, broken arms, legs, cirrhosis, incarceration, broken families. I mean, I can go on and on and on. We're spending billions, but none of that addresses the problem. And that is to treat addiction and invest in recovery support. That's the only solution. So stop investing in the problem and start investing in the solution. And again, it's your tax dollars, it's my tax dollars, it's every viewer's tax dollars. We need to say to them, treating addiction, supporting recovery is a priority. That's the issue.
What are we doing right, and what are we doing not necessarily wrong, but what could we do better?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that we're doing right. I mean, first and foremost, the reality is that you and I have a conversation where we're talking about 23 million people living life in recovery. I mean, how extraordinary is that? I mean, I've been doing this a long time. We never, ever were able to talk about that. You know, so we're making progress. That's of no consolation whatsoever to to anybody who's watching this who's struggling with their own addiction or their family. So we have a responsibility as people who know and understand recovery to stand up on their behalf, to say they need help, they need resources, and we need to invest our tax dollars, our insurance dollars in providing them the access to the treatment and services and recovery supports that they need. That's what we need to do.
What are some other things that people should know about Friends of Recovery New York? And why should somebody get involved? There's so many things that people can get involved with nowadays. There's
Sure.
so many different, ways people can invest their time, their money.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, in our family, my wife and I have made a decision, although we're touched by a variety of other health issues in our family, that all of our donated dollars only go to addiction.
Mm.
And it's not because we don't care about heart and diabetes and MDA and everything else, but the reality is that nobody else is standing up and making that investment. So I say to anybody who's watching this, we need your dollars and your support to be prioritized on this issue. We're not doing it. We need to do more. So people need to find a way to become engaged. You can be a volunteer, you can be a donor, you can be a board member, you can attend events. There's a million different ways that people can get engaged. And let me give you one example. When I was the executive director of a local council, my board chairman was a man in long-term recovery. He knew everybody in the community. And one day when we were meeting with the county legislature, he slammed his fist on the table and swore at the chairman of the legislature because the chairman had said, we're not spending any money on those people.
Mm.
Now, what was different about this legislator was that, in his case at least, he said what he felt. Many others do not. But in this case, what happened is the board chair, on the way back to the office, I said, what are you doing yelling at him? And he says, Bob, I know what alcoholism and addiction did to my family. And I also know what recovery did. And if I don't get up and yell and scream, who will?
If we don't, who will? If not now, when?
That's the answer. And he said, somebody spoke up on my behalf when I was unable. And as a result, I'm living life in recovery today. He said, it's my turn. So to anybody who's watching this, who is in any way connected to alcoholism and addiction, we need your voice. We need your participation. We need your volunteer time. We need your dollars and support. That's the only way that we're going to overcome the stigma. The only way that we'll develop the programs, services, and resources that people so desperately need. So we don't have to have vigils on overdose tests.
Well, that's my question.
It's about celebrating recovery.
How do we get people involved before they're impacted making funeral arrangements?
It's difficult because one of the things that is so challenging today is that for any family who's living with alcoholism and addiction, they literally don't have any idea where to go.
How do we get help? I hear that over and over and over again.
And what they tend to do is they tend to approach it from a common sense standpoint. And common sense says, when I have a problem like this, I go to my physician, psychiatrist, social worker, or clergy. And regrettably, the great majority of them are not trained in alcoholism and addiction, and more importantly, are not successfully experienced in helping. So first step is to get to people who really know and understand alcoholism and addiction, specifically trained and experienced, and have been successful introducing people to recovery. So that's the message that families need to hear. And the other piece for families is that it's not about, here's my son or daughter, fix them. It's about our assuming the responsibility to educate them. So here's what alcoholism and addiction are. Here's how it's affected the person you're concerned about. Here's how it's affecting your family. And here's what you need to get help for your family. And now that we've had all this conversation, we can talk about how to help the person you're concerned about. But again, families need recovery support as much as the individual who's living with addiction as well.
We're winding down in time. This is your camera, Bob. What would be your message to anyone watching today, directly, indirectly affected by the disease of addiction, a family member, loved one? What would be your message to that person?
Yeah, I mean, my message is very simple, and that is that recovery from alcoholism and addiction is a reality for 23 million people. As you live with this issue, as you struggle with this issue, we need your voice, we need your engagement, we need your participation. There is no question how New York responds to this issue today is going to be very different than what happens in the next 10 years. And the only way we get there is with your engagement, with your involvement. We need your help.
The website?
Website is for New York, FOR-NY.org.
And we'll show that. And
absolutely.
Also the phone number. Someone wants to reach out to you. Bob, thank you so much.
You're welcome. And again, Dean, thanks for everything you're doing.